A Gaza ceasefire deal backed by Hamas, the US and governments worldwide. But implementing it will mean overcoming major obstacles. What are the challenges and what's needed from each side? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. The last hurdle has been the wait for Israel to ink a Gaza ceasefire deal, one that's been agreed by everyone else, from Hamas, the US and Israel's Western allies, to the UN and governments worldwide. While Israeli politicians squabbled, its military continued to kill with a ferocity more like the start of a war than its possible end. Under the phase deal, Hamas is to free Israeli captives in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. Gaza will get humanitarian aid and its people will be allowed to return to their homes, or at least what's left of them. But in a place bombed to desolation, how can this be achieved and who will oversee the implementation of the agreement? We'll hear from our panel in a few moments, but first, this report from Ekelsun Sharif.
15 months of Israeli airstrikes and raids have devastated Gaza. But many of the Palestinians displaced from their homes still want to return when the three-state ceasefire is due to come into effect on January the 19th. During the first 6-week phase, Israel has agreed to pull back its troops to the outskirts of the Strip, allowing people to travel freely. After enduring months of unimaginable horror, many are looking forward to reuniting with their families.
I hope to see my loved ones and brothers and return to my home. Even though it's been bombed, we will return to our land. It is enough.
Desperately needed humanitarian aid will flow into Gaza during this phase, 600 trucks a day. The UN and charities have accused Israel of obstructing aid deliveries in the past by delaying trucks at inspection checkpoints and attacking convoys. The transportation of life-saving supplies is further complicated by Israel's relentless strikes, which have destroyed roads. And there are fears of more looting. Armed gangs attacked trucks in November, forcing the United Nations to halt its operations. UN Chief Antonio Guterres has called for any security obstacles to be removed.
The humanitarian situation is at catastrophic levels, and I call on all parties to facilitate the rapid, unhindered and safe humanitarian relief for all civilians in need.
In Israel, families of the captives held in Gaza are relieved but anxious. Hamas is to release them in stages, 33 initially, in exchange for 1,000 Palestinian prisoners.
I'm going to be happy going to believe it just whenever I'm going to see the hostages crossing the border to Israel. We don't know the situation of all the hostages. I don't know if Ofer, my cousin, is still alive or not.
Others fear their own government will jeopardize the deal.
I'm afraid that our government, especially I'm afraid from our government, that they will do something wrong to stop the agreement.
US President Joe Biden proposed the ceasefire deal in May last year. But despite intense negotiations, Hamas and Israel were unable to reach an agreement, a failure that's cost more Palestinian lives. In 8 months since, Israeli attacks killed 10,000 Palestinians, taking the death toll from the war to nearly 47,000. Kulsum Sharif, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from London is Andreas Krieg, an associate professor at the School of Security Studies at King's College London. In Tel Aviv is Yossi Beilin. He is a former Israeli cabinet minister who initiated the Oslo peace process in 1992. And in Doha, Tamer, who is an associate professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies and the author of Delivering Aid Without Government, a book about the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. Welcome to you all. I'd like to start in Tel Aviv with Yossi Beilin. Yossi, This is a phased deal, a phased agreement that will take place over over several months. But a phased deal is almost certainly going to fail at some point. Is this deal designed to fail?
I hope not. You are right that the phased deal is much worse than a deal which can be immediately implemented. Apparently, the parties preferred a phased deal. I don't understand exactly the motivations on both sides, but this is now the situation. This is the agreement that we have, and we should do the best in order to assure that it is implemented and not breached.
Let me come to Tamer in Doha. Tamer, you wrote a book about delivering aid into Gaza, the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. That's part of the deal. But there is no way that anybody could have foreseen the sheer amount of damage that Israel has wrought on the Gaza Strip. This is going to be a decades-long process and it might well be able to begin in the phased deal, but it won't be completed.
Imran, true. The reality in Gaza is very grim. We're talking about estimates of between $50 billion to $80 billion. We're talking about decades to come for Gaza to recover, not in terms of infrastructure or environment itself. Gaza environmental ecosystem has been depleted, and it requires decades to recover. It's a very grim reality. There are many questions also. Who's going to pay this bill? The donors community. We know. Globally, donors are facing what we call donors fatigue. With all these conflicts going around in Ukraine, now the Middle East, and most importantly, even if there is a will to finance the reconstruction of Gaza. The international community requires guarantees now and assurances that these funds that will go to reconstruction will not be wasted again in a continuous circle of war. So what I'm trying to say is stability is a must this time. And for me, it's not clear yet. How is this reconstruction process gonna kick off? Because again, politically, we live in a mess. The entire situation is still very messy. We see the Americans and the Israelis saying there will be no reconstruction as long as Hamas is in power or in control of Gaza. But at the same time, they are negotiating with Hamas because Hamas did not go away.
Tamer, you've made some very good points there, and we have time to get into them all. But I want to bring in Andreas here. Andreas, you've seen the deal. We've all seen the deal. It's a phased deal. What are the pitfalls that you see, the most obvious ones? Where could this fail quickly, or is it going to fail after the first hurdle, after the first phase?
It's quite obvious why both parties went to a phased deal, because they're still on diametrically opposed, sides of the divide, and they have diametrically opposed objectives. So that this kind of deal is as good as it gets. But let's be honest here. For now, this is a hostage/prisoner exchange deal. This is not a ceasefire deal. There will be a truce attached to the exchange of prisoners. But if you look at the rhetoric, if you look at the intent, particularly on the side of Israel, of that Israeli government, there is no real intent to bring the war to an end. And there are quite a lot of stepping stones along the way. If the greatest concession I think that Hamas has made, already last summer when the deal could have been had in the first instance, is that they are allowing Israel to remain within the Gaza Strip. So we're having a phased withdrawal, but in phase one, Israel will, even at the end of phase one, Israel will remain especially within the Netzarim corridor. And if you then look at phase two, which is extremely ambiguous already, even then Israel has a lot of sort of levers it can use to remain. So it doesn't bring the war to an end per se. It's kind of creating a window for the exchange of prisoners. And I think that as well is tied to the delivery of humanitarian aid. And here is another issue. Humanitarian aid can be brought into the Gaza Strip, but how it will be distributed, how it will be secured without a law enforcement on the ground, big question marks. And if one of the deliverable is humanitarian aid and it won't be delivered, will Hamas just stop the deal and stop the exchange of prisoners? Because, mind you, that's how the deal in November 2023 eventually came to an end. So, optimism is great, but let's be honest. I mean, this is a first phase, and we have no bridge into phase 2 yet.
Yossi, let me bring you in here. One of the problems with this deal, why it was so difficult to get in the first place, was internal Israeli politics. The far-right ministers, Ben Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, opposed to this deal completely. They are still a force to be reckoned with in Israeli politics, and they're looking for the war to continue. How much pressure is that putting on Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister?
Much less than before. I mean, apparently before they were critical, and Ben Gvir himself just said a few days ago that he was the one who prevented the agreements from being signed in the past. Now, according to his promise, he's going to resign once the government approves the deal, meaning in an hour or less, which between us is a great relief for many of us. So he will not be in the government as a veto holder. And the government, on the one hand, has a majority, but it doesn't need a majority because the opposition will wholeheartedly support any deal, including, of course, the current deal. So, first of all, the government will easily implement it or sign it, or and the exchange of prisoners and hostages will happen from Sunday on. For the future, it might be more difficult for Netanyahu to hold this coalition, and the opposition will give him, I presume so, a safety nest so that he's not going to fall. This is the current situation. Maybe it made it easier for him to accept the deal, but I think that the Trump factor played a very important role. Trump is considered by Netanyahu as a very close friend, and it is difficult to say no to a friend.
Let's bring in Tamer here. Tamer, it's difficult to say no to a friend. The spectre of Donald Trump over this deal has been very, very large. I mean, he has said himself, we got this deal. This is the exact same deal that Biden had put forward, couldn't get it. What has Trump promised, do you think, to Netanyahu? And is it the annexation of the occupied West Bank?
Imran, I mean, concretely, we really don't know what Trump is promising Netanyahu. But in reality, we see that there is a major map that is changing in the Middle East, starting from Gaza, ending with Lebanon and Syria. And we don't know the snowball, where will it end exactly? We know there is the Iranian also factor, the Yemeni factor as well. I think. I mean, in my opinion, I think this snowball will continue more or less because obviously where Trump and Netanyahu agree that there is a need to be a drastic change in the region, and I think Trump is, in my opinion, is willing to help Netanyahu in achieving his goals more or less. But the thing is, Gaza has. I think where the two of them disagree is that the war in Gaza has exhausted itself, and there is no strategic goals anywhere to go. So the only way to end the conflict in Gaza and restore the political process between the Palestinians and Israelis goes through the negotiations. And I think this is where I anticipate, in my opinion, that there might be an American proposal on the table, a political settlement that does not per se satisfy the Palestinians nor the Israelis, but something will come up on the table for discussion soon. Because really, realistically, militarily, I mean, there is nothing more that Israel can achieve in Gaza. Destroying Hamas has turned to be a myth. Palestinians are not going anywhere.
Well, Tamer, let me pick up on that point. Let me pick up on that point.
Yeah.
Andreas, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but Yossi, what we're talking about is a very, very difficult set of negotiations where this time around the Americans and Donald Trump is a deciding factor, almost. Where is the US-Israel relationship post-Biden? Where do you think it is right now? Is it stronger?
It's a little bit premature to judge. I think that Trump did not come to power in order to help Netanyahu to fulfill his dreams. He may be softer to him, or not necessarily softer, but he may help him in one thing. Netanyahu in the past was afraid that even if the other side breaches the agreement, the Americans will not agree to back Israel in retaliating. And will tell the Israel, you know what, something happened here, something happened there. Don't retaliate so quickly because you will destroy the whole structure. Apparently, he got from Trump a promise, I don't know in which shape, that once he is convinced that the Hamas is breaching the agreement, he will back Israel in retaliation. Now, this is the most... I would say, difficult point in the whole story. Because, as you said before, the extreme right is very much against stopping the war, wanted very much to get to be sure that if there is some breach, Israel will get back to the war. And if Netanyahu is between the extreme right and between Trump, I believe that this time, he will be more worried about the American side than about the extreme right in Israel.
Andreas, I want to bring you in here. There is an element to all of this of robbing Peter to pay Paul. You've got a ceasefire deal in Gaza. It's going to be implemented, at least phase one seems like it's going to happen. But the occupied West Bank, there's still a war going on there. The fear is that the Israelis will shift their focus even more to the occupied West Bank. What will that mean, generally speaking, for any ceasefire deal going forward and any other phases? Or do you think the two things are fairly separate?
Not at all separate. I mean, the Israelis have been so occupied with Hamas and Gaza, and they were trying to cognitively somewhat separate what happens in the West Bank, occupation in the West Bank, all this sort of coercion that happened in the West Bank over years and years and years, separating this from what happened in Gaza, which obviously you cannot do. And so eventually, and that's where I think long term, if you want peace in Gaza, and if you want to go to phase 3, which is about reconstruction, which is about setting up a socio-political element of governance in Gaza, if you want to get to this point, you need to create essentially a situation which has a pathway towards Palestinian self-determination. And Palestinian self-determination in this context also means that the situation in the West Bank can't be made worse, but that they actively have to work towards some sort of political solution there as well. Because phase 3 is really premised on this to happen. And that's why I'm so pessimistic about this deal ever being implemented, bringing this to an end, bringing this war to an end, because it will eventually mean you have to get peace in the West Bank. And that is also the kind of foundation on basis of which the Gulf states, for example, will come in, bring money into Gaza and help, as well as potentially setting up a socio-political governance mechanism within Palestine. Even Saudi normalization is premised on them making progress, the Israelis making progress in opening a road towards Palestinian state in the West Bank.
Tamer, I'll bring you in a second, but Yossi, you end the occupation, you build a Palestinian state, and all of this just goes away. It's something that you tried to do in 1992 with the Oslo Accords. That was supposed to be the framework for a future peace deal. Oslo has failed, let's be honest. It's not really being implemented. Is there a new way forward at the end of all of this?
In my view, there is a new way forward. And the new way forward should be a two-state solution based on the 67 borders with mutual land swaps. under an umbrella of an Israeli-Palestinian confederation. I think that that might help the Israeli decision makers to understand that they can leave the West Bank, even though some of the settlers will remain there, but they will remain under the Palestinian rule, and it will be under also under the umbrella of a confederation. And I think that if we do something like that, and the same number of Palestinian citizens will be allowed to come to live in Israel as residents, as permanent residents, and the Israelis will live as permanent residents on the Palestinian side, I think that this may solve the problem because, as it was said before, the number of the settlers is big. I mean, it is now all in the West Bank 500,000. If you add to it East Jerusalem, it is more than 200,000. And although some of them or most of them will be annexed to Israel in a very small area, I think that for the rest of them, it will be very difficult to convince any Israeli future prime minister who would like to have peace with the Palestinians to evacuate them. So the umbrella of a confederation may help us solve the problem, and we have an opportunity, as you said just now. I mean, about the Saudi Arabia, about the Emirates, and about the United States. If Mr. Trump wants to get a Peace Nobel Prize, let him get it and go for it.
Tamer, what Yossi is saying sounds perfectly reasonable. But reality is that Israel is an incredibly right-wing country right now. And getting any kind of permanent solution is just impossible.
I don't think it's impossible if there is an international will, and especially an American will. And again, where I agree with Yossi is the Trump factor. I mean, if there is anything Trump can offer to end this conflict and to leave this noble legacy for him, I think it's all welcome. But I think again, whether it's Trump or someone else, the American factor is very important. The U.S. has to look at this conflict strategically, meaning we see all these normalization waves. Most important, relevant Arab countries have already normalized with Israel. The only country that is remaining is Saudi Arabia, more or less, which is a key and influential country in the region. So my question, if Saudi Arabia normalizes, then what we see is a regional bloc which is literally in bed with the U.S., economically, politically, etc. So Israel, in this sense, if it does not change its behavior and ends more or less this conflict with the Palestinians, reach to a just solution with the Palestinians, will also become a liability in somehow to the U.S. administration or to the Americans as well. Because so far, Israel has been justifying this conflict, annexation of land, as an existential threat. But if the entire region has more or less accepted or hinting that it is accepting Israel as a country, as a neighbor, then why not to end the Palestinian conflict? And I think this would be a critical point or a critical juncture. If we get to this point where Israel, by its radical, impulsive
Tamer, we are running out of time, and I'm going to bring in Andreas here. Yeah, I'm going to bring in Andreas here. Andreas, you've got to get a point where the international community has the will to get a Palestinian state. That's what all, I guess, seem to be saying. But that international will, that coalition building, isn't as easy as saying, well, Saudi normalizes with Israel and that's the final obstacle over, is it? Or is it as that simple?
No, it's not, but I agree with the previous speakers. The key always to get Israel to agree to anything is US pressure. And it comes down to whoever sits in the White House and the willingness of that president to put the necessary pressure on Israel. And I think that's the massive black and white difference that we're seeing between Biden and Biden administration and the Trump administration. I think I want to say, though, that there is agency. I mean, number one, the Palestinians have to solve their own leadership issues. I mean, that is also part of it. This is not an external sort of thing of the international community has to come around. I mean, the Palestinians need to settle their own differences internally. Secondly, I think the Arab world has a leading role to play in this. The US, especially under Trump, will not lead a strategy because that's not what Trump is interested in. He doesn't have a mandate to solve peace or to bring peace to the Middle East. But I think what is important is the Gulf lobby. The UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia have extensive networks in Washington. They have extreme ways in and influence into most of the key brokers of that Trump administration who will play a role in the Middle East, including Witkoff. And I think this leverage, this influence, it goes deeper than Israeli networks in Washington. And so if the Gulf countries were coming together and actually bringing a particular proposal on, delivering it, putting on the table, putting pressure on Trump to actually deliver it and put pressure and manhandle Netanyahu, whoever's going to be prime minister in Israel, into that deal, it could be done. I'm quite optimistic about this. The Gulf has extreme agency and a lot of power as well. The only issue is they are still not assertive enough to kind of use that leverage. They're waiting for America to take the lead. And the US is not going to take the lead on anything. Donald Trump was voted in on a domestic agenda. And so we need regional leadership in conjunction with Palestinian leadership. We need to find an alternative to Fatah and Hamas on the ground. And
Andreas, we're almost out of time. I want to come to Yossi for a final thought. Yossi, this is a phase deal. We've talked about the fact that phase deals are almost designed to fail. How far do you think this ceasefire agreement will get to? Will it get to reconstruction? Will it get to people being able to return back to their destroyed homes?
We will have to pray every day for its success. It will not be simple, but as we all said before, it is now in the hands of the Americans to monitor and to assure that nobody is playing games with them on both sides, and that this very important agreement is implemented. And then I think that many other options will be open.
I want to thank all our guests, Andreas Krieg, Yossi Beilin and Tamer Qarmout. And thank you, too, for watching. Now, you can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.